comprehensive analysis of the American Mafia. The phenomenon of the American Mafia, historically referred to by its initiates as La Cosa Nostra, represents a sophisticated synthesis of Old World traditions and New World industrial opportunities. Its resilience over the past century is not merely a consequence of criminal brutality, but is rooted in a highly evolved organizational architecture that mirrors corporate and military governance. This report analyzes the trajectory of the organization from its agrarian Sicilian origins to its role as a shadow government in American urban centers, and finally to its 21st century adaptation into high-tech fraud and digital gambling markets. Historiographical foundations and the Sicilian prototype. The American Mafia cannot be understood without an examination of the socio-economic conditions of 19th century Sicily. The organization emerged during Italy's unification period as a response to lawlessness and the absence of a reliable state judiciary. In the transition from feudalism to a capitalist land economy, absentee landlords required protection for their estates against bandits. This created a demand for private enforcers, or Mafia, who eventually consolidated power to control entire villages. The etymology of Mafia remains a subject of academic debate, with theories suggesting a derivation from the Sicilian mafuz, signifying swagger or bravado, or Arabic roots such as Mahia's bold man, reflecting the island's 9th century history under Arab rule. By the turn of the 20th century, these disparate groups had formed a loose confederation that dominated the economic activities of Western Sicily. When mass migration to the United States began, these criminal patterns were reproduced in poor Italian immigrant neighborhoods like East Harlem and the Lower East Side. The myth and reality of the Black Hand. Initial public perceptions of Italian organized crime focused on the Black Hand, La Mano Nera. Contrary to popular belief, the Black Hand was not a monolithic organization, but a decentralized extortion methodology utilized by various independent gangs. Criminals would send threatening letters to wealthy immigrants, marked with a black hand, demanding money under threat of violence or arson. While these gangs were precursors to the Mafia, they lacked the cohesive structure and national coordination that would later define La Cosa Nostra. Pre-prohibition criminal entity organizational structure, primary method, participant profile. Sicilian Mafia Old World, village-based clans, protection of landed estates, agrarian enforcers. Black Hand, Mano Nera, loose, decentralized cells, individual extortion. Kidnapping, immigrant predators. Camorra, Neapolitan, urban-based gangs vice. Smuggling, extortion, urban laborers. Ndrangheta, Calabrian, blood-related families kidnapping. Trade control, rural kinship groups. The Prohibition catalyst and the industrialization of vice. The enactment of the Volstead Act in 1920 served as the single most significant catalyst for the modernization of American organized crime. Prohibition transformed the Mafia from neighborhood predators into industrial-scale syndicates. The illegal distribution of alcohol required management skills, inter-gang cooperation, and high-level political corruption that transcended previous ethnic boundaries. By the mid-1920s, gangs began to exert control over municipal governments, transitioning from minions of politicians to their directors. This era saw the rise of the Mustache Petes, traditionalist Sicilian bosses who maintained old world customs and were suspicious of non-Sicilians. However, a younger generation of mobsters, led by figures like Charles Lucky Luciano, recognized that the traditional model was insufficient for the scale of Prohibition-era profits. Luciano's philosophy focused on cooperation with other ethnic gangs, such as the Jewish and Irish syndicates, to ensure a stable business environment free from the explosions of constant gang warfare. The Castellammarese War and the birth of the Commission. The structural maturity of the American Mafia was finalized following the Castellammarese War, 1930 to 1931, a bloody conflict for dominance in New York's underworld. The war was primarily a struggle between Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Masuria represented the archaic, authoritarian style of leadership, while Maranzano sought to implement a rigid hierarchy inspired by ancient Roman military ranks. On April 15, 1931, Lucky Luciano orchestrated the assassination of Masuria at a Coney Island restaurant to end the conflict. Maranzano briefly became the supreme authority, declaring himself Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses, and organizing the New York gangs into 5 families. However, his autocratic ambitions led to his own assassination on September 10, 1931, on the orders of Luciano. The abolition of autocracy. Luciano's most significant contribution was the abolition of the boss of bosses title, which he viewed as a source of unnecessary friction and a target for ambitious challengers. In its place, he established the Commission, a ruling committee designed to oversee all mafia activities in the United States. The Commission functioned as a board of directors that mediated territorial disputes, approved leadership successions, and sanctioned the murders of high-ranking members. Official title traditional designation role within the hierarchy governance authority. Boss Don / Godfather, head of the family. Final arbiter absolute within territory. Under Boss Sato Capo, second in command. Daily logistics acting boss during absence. Consigliere counselor advisor. Dispute mediator non-voting. Influential counsel. Capo regime Capo / captain leads a crew of soldiers management of revenue streams. Soldier made man inducted member. Sworn enforcer execution of orders. Associate affiliate non-inducted specialist / worker operational support. Regional analysis. The NYC Pentarchy and Midwestern autonomy. The American Mafia's power was concentrated in the Northeast and the Midwest, but its operational models varied significantly between these regions. While New York was divided among 5 families to prevent any single faction from dominating the port and industries, other cities often operated under a unified command. The 5 families of New York. The 5 families, the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno organizations, established a dominance that lasted from 1931 through the 1980s. Each family was assigned specific territories and industries, such as the concrete business, garment district, and airport cargo handling. The Genovese family, originally led by Luciano, became the Ivy League of the mob, focusing on labor racketeering and maintaining a high degree of secrecy. The Gambino family achieved its peak under Carlo Gambino, who advocated for low-profile traditional rackets like loan sharking and discouraged narcotics to avoid long prison sentences. The Lucchese family focused on the trucking and garment industries, while the Colombo family was frequently destabilized by internal wars. The Bonanno family, despite early prominence, suffered a loss of prestige after the 1970s Donnie Brasco infiltration. The Chicago outfit, unified dominance. Unlike New York, the Chicago outfit emerged as a unified faction that never had to share its primary territory with rival families. Under Al Capone, the outfit consolidated power through extreme violence and deep political integration. Following Capone's tax evasion conviction, leaders like Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca shifted the organization toward a more corporate model, specializing in labor union control and the skimming of profits from Las Vegas casinos. The outfit's influence stretched across the Midwest, representing families in Milwaukee, Kansas City, and St. Louis on the National Commission. Geopolitics of the Steel Valley, Youngstown, and the Border Wars. A particularly nuanced example of mafia influence is found in the Mahoning Valley, specifically Youngstown and Girard, Ohio. This region, known as Crimetown, USA, became a contested neutral zone between the Cleveland and Pittsburgh crime families because Youngstown was too small to support its own independent family. It served as a battlefield where outside factions fought for control of the steel mill workers' gambling and numbers, the bug rackets. The Cleveland versus Pittsburgh conflict. The 1950s and 60s in Youngstown were defined by the Youngstown tune-up, a euphemism for the car bombings that became the trademark of regional mob warfare. The Pittsburgh family, represented by the Naples brothers, competed fiercely against the Cleveland family, led by figures like Vince De Niro and later the Carabia brothers. The violence reached national prominence in November 1962 when a car bomb killed mob figure Charles Cavallero and his 11-year-old son. The ensuing corruption was so deep that the Mafia effectively controlled the local sheriff, James Traficant, the county prosecutor, and several judges. This culture of collusion persisted until the late 1990s, when a botched hit on prosecutor Paul Gaines led to a massive federal investigation and the collapse of the Strollo organization. The turning point, Appalachian, and the end of Hoover's denial. For much of the mid-20th century, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover prioritized the investigation of political subversives over organized crime, often dismissing reports of a national mafia conspiracy as folklore. This stance became untenable following the Appalachian meeting on November 14, 1957. Mafia leaders from across the country converged on the estate of Joseph Barbara in rural Appalachian, New York, to settle leadership disputes following the assassination of Albert Anastasia. When local state troopers noticed the influx of luxury vehicles and set up a roadblock, dozens of high-ranking mobsters fled into the surrounding woods. The apprehension of 58 powerful crime figures provided undeniable proof of a coordinated national criminal network. In response, Hoover was forced to establish the Top Hoodlum program and pivot the FBI's resources toward the Mafia. The strategic decline, RICO, and the informant crisis. The 1970 enactment of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, RICO, Act marked the beginning of the Mafia's institutional decline. RICO allowed prosecutors to target the heads of families by linking them to the crimes committed by their subordinates as part of a criminal enterprise. The landmark 1986 commission trial decimated the leadership of the New York Five families. Furthermore, the prospect of 100-year prison sentences prompted many members to violate the Code of Omerta. High-profile defections, such as Sammy the Bull Gravano and Angelo Leonardo, provided the government with intimate knowledge of the Commission's inner workings, leading to the imprisonment of entire administrations. The 21st century, modern rackets, and the NBA gambling scandal. While the American Mafia no longer possesses the political clout it held during the mid-20th century, it remains an active and adaptive threat. Modern operations have shifted away from traditional labor racketeering, which was largely absorbed by corporate consolidation, toward high-stakes, digital fraud, and niche gambling markets. The 2025 NBA gambling prosecution, a definitive example of the Mafia's 21st century evolution, is the October 23, 2025 federal indictment involving 34 individuals, including members of the Bonanno, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese families. This operation utilized sophisticated technology to rig poker games and leveraged insider information from professional basketball figures to manipulate sports betting markets. The technology employed in this scheme represents a significant departure from historical methods. Conspirators used altered card shuffling machines that could read decks and transmit the data to off-site collaborators. These collaborators then signaled players at the table via wireless communication, ensuring that the house players always won. The use of NBA legends like Chauncey Billups served as face cards to attract wealthy victims who felt safe playing in the presence of celebrity athletes. Cultural semiotics and public perception. The evolution of the Mafia is also a story of cultural transformation. In the early 20th century, mobsters were portrayed as grotesque dregs of humanity. Following the 1970s Godfather effect, they were reimagined as tragic, complex anti-heroes who embodied the dark side of the American dream. Films and television series like Goodfellas and The Sopranos highlighted the mundane and often desperate reality of mid-level mobsters, showing them breaking parking meters for change or living under the constant threat of federal surveillance. These portrayals created a public fascination that often obscures the organization's continued role in violent extortion and community destabilization. Synthesis and future outlook. The American Mafia has demonstrated an extraordinary ability to survive through three primary mechanisms: structural insulation, political corruption, and technological adaptation. The transition from the rural enforcers of Sicily to the high-tech gamblers of the 21st century highlights a criminal organization that functions more like a fluid network than a static hierarchy. While the families are no longer appointing judges or state senators, as they did in the era of Al Capone or the Naples brothers, they remain a significant and powerful presence in metropolitan areas across the Northeast and Midwest. The 2025 NBA scandal underscores the ongoing reality that La Cosa Nostra continues to exploit new industries, proving that as long as there are lucrative illegal markets and opportunities for institutional corruption, the organization will continue to evolve and persist. A sophisticated synthesis of old world traditions.